Okay, welcome. So we are continuing our discussion of Spinoza, and in this discussion, we're going to be thinking about the nature of God. So one of the big philosophical questions, one that we've already been thinking about this semester with other early modern philosophers. So for instance, Descartes told us that the nature of God is that God is no deceiver. Right. Or for instance, Marie de Gournay told us that God does not have a sex or a gender, that you are a bad philosopher and theologian if you think that God has a gender. I think that Spinoza would actually agree on that point. So one point that we can preview, what is the nature of God? Well, Spinoza is going to tell us that the nature of God is not very much like the nature of people. So what does that really mean? How does Spinoza get there? That's what we're going to talk about in this clip. So in that last video, we got through Spinoza's rather strange and complicated argument that there is one infinite substance with infinite attributes. The big kicker there is that being self-caused or self-sufficient in your existence is an attribute. No two substances of distinct kind can have the same attribute, and any substance would have to have this attribute of self-sufficiency. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a substance. But this gets Spinoza to the view that there could only be one kind of substance, and that any attribute which reveals a substance would be an attribute of the one substance. If that sounds like a mouthful, go back and watch the discussion of Spinoza's argument that there's only one substance. So that was last time. This time around, we're going to look at Spinoza's idea that the infinite substance is what we should call God. And what we're going to be doing is figuring out the nature of God. So why is it that Spinoza would agree with de Gournay that it would be a mistake to think of God as an individual, say, with a sex or a gender? One other thing that we'll backtrack to, this was out of the Shapiro and Lascano book, or out of the Ethics. This is definition 6. Remember that Spinoza lays out his arguments with a series of definitions and axioms, and then he just develops a bunch of proofs based on what he thinks are undeniable definitions and self-evident truths. So that's going to be our project. One other thing, and this is just of historical note, Spinoza's view did get some contemporary uptake. Perhaps one of the biggest changes in the history of physics is when Albert Einstein would eventually upend Newtonian physics with his theory of relativity. When people would ask Albert Einstein if he believed in God, here's what he said to somebody in 1929. He wrote, "I believe in Spinoza's God." And what is it about Spinoza's God that he believes in? Well, Spinoza's God reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists. He does not believe in a God who concerns himself with the fate and the doings of mankind. Now, so here we already have a picture. We might think of God as the totality of nature. And we don't want to think about God as, say, like a guy. Let's look at what Spinoza tells us at Proposition 14. This is at the top of the second column of page 374 in our Shapiro and Lascano text. Spinoza says, "Given that God is a being absolutely finite of which no attribute can be negated that expresses the essence of substance." So all the aspects that reveal substance to us pardon the dogs. I'm going to go close a door. Okay, getting back to it. God is absolutely infinite. All the attributes are in God, and he necessarily exists. Spinoza also points out, if there were any substance beside God, it would have to be explained by some attribute of God, but then we would have two substances, right? We'd have God, and then maybe the other substances, like material reality or minds. But if that were to happen, then these two things would have the same attribute, but that would be absurd. Because Spinoza tells us that there's no attribute sharing between distinct substances. An attribute just is a substance revealer, and you couldn't have an attribute revealing substance if it was revealing one thing or another thing. Right? Therefore, there cannot be substances besides God, and consequently, none can be conceived. For if it be conceived, it would necessarily have to be conceived as existence, but that's absurd. Right? He says, therefore, besides God, no substance can exist or be conceived. So the thought here is that as soon as we start trying to think about a thing that is a substance but which is not God, we run into the contradictions that would be inherent from Spinoza's system. Because we're going to say, look, an attribute is just a feature that reveals what kind of thing we're dealing with. You couldn't have attribute sharing between God and separate things. So this view is sometimes referred to as pantheism. So when we're talking about pantheism, this is the view that God is in everything, right? So we might say, like, look, this mechanical pencil, there is a little bit of, there's an aspect of God, or that which underlies its existence is God, the necessarily existent being. Your mind, right? There must be a substance that's doing the thinking. Well, in fact, your mind is one way of the eternal infinite substance of being and unfolding. I just realized I missed an H there. There we go, pantheism. Excuse my spelling error there. The dog's barking threw me off. Right, but here's the thought. The thing that is really real is God, the necessarily existent being, and then everything else in the universe is an aspect or affectation or mode of God. So, within this approach, we can say, like, look, there's only one thing, that one thing is God. Now, I think that we should notice here that this gives us a very unorthodox picture of the nature of God. We might say, like, look, if everything is an expression of God, does that make God divisible? Well, if you go to Proposition 15, Spinoza is actually going to say no. He says you can divide things abstractly and superficially, but if you're talking about substance itself, you cannot coherently divide it, right? Maybe in a similar way, you could think about the infinite thing, which is the series of numbers. Now, to some extent, you could abstractly divide it, right? By thinking about, the subset of that series, which is the series of prime numbers. But you haven't actually done this thing, which is cutting the numbers in half. You've just added an abstraction by thinking about the subset of the prime numbers. We also have already discussed in the previous video the idea that, look, you can't really divide material reality. Like, as soon as you rip a piece of paper in half, air gets in between what was there. Spinoza seems to think that there is no vacuum, there is no absence of material reality. When you think about material reality, it's always full. Right? So on the Spinozistic view, you are thinking abstractly or superficially when you think about divisions within the infinite. You're not really dividing the infinite when you imagine that you're doing it. There's a further question. Somebody might say, okay, so we've got this view, God is the infinite substance with infinite attributes. We can ask, does God have free will? Well, Spinoza will actually say yes, because of how he defines what it means to be free. So if we go to the definition of freedom right at the outset of Spinoza's Ethics, so if we are in Shapiro and Lascano, you are on page 369, but you can also just look at definition 7. So this is like very first page of Spinoza's Ethics. He says, a thing is called free if it exists solely by the necessity of its own nature, and if it is determined to act by itself alone. Right? So he points out in Corollary 2 of Proposition 17, some 8 pages later in the textbook, that actually God acts freely. We could say that God has free will. That word will might be a little bit pesky. But we could say that, look, God is acting out of its own nature. God is not constrained by anything. And in this way, Spinoza is going to tell us that God is the sole free cause. Now, part of why Spinoza will be hesitant to say that God has free will, so maybe I should even just scratch that word. We could say, does God act freely? Right? Or does God have freedom? Right? When we're asking if God has freedom, we might say that God is a very special case, because God is the one being that is self-sufficient in their existence. Right? And this is the other thing to notice about Spinoza. He's going to say that if God has an intellect and a will, these things would be very different from the human analogs, right? Because part of what it is to be a human being with an intellect is to be figuring things out with partial amounts of information, right? We would also notice that having a will is to be striving towards things that you lack. Well, it would actually be a paradox, Spinoza points out, for God to be thinking about all the things that he could achieve, because then we would think that, if God thought about all the things that he could achieve, then he wouldn't be doing them. But if he did them all, then he would be out of things to further achieve. That would be paradoxical. What's wrong with this is we should probably not ascribe an intellect or a will to God in such a way that it would make God limited or incoherent. God is just the big infinite and does not even behave in a way that involves having a will or an intellect. Wills and intellects are things for our puny human brains. And in this way, Spinoza is strongly against anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism just means putting the form, morphism, of humans, anthro, or anthrop. We might say that So human forming things, right? He says we should not bend the nature of God to our picture of what people are like, right? So it would be anthropomorphism, for instance, to attribute a will and an intellect to God, right? So Spinoza says, those who confuse divine and human nature readily attribute to God human feelings. So it seems like Spinoza is saying, like, look, it's very easy to think about God being jealous of your worshiping other gods or being angry at you for committing a certain act. Spinoza is going to point out that that way of thinking is putting human feelings on God. And the mistake you're making there is to confuse human nature with divine nature. Right? Now, this line of thought goes way back, right? So the pre-Socratic ancient philosopher Xenophanes, or Xenophanes, sorry about the pronunciation there, but Xenophanes will also point out that often what we're doing when we think about God is we are projecting human features onto the divine. Where Xenophanes points out that, if birds invented gods, those gods would have feathers, right? And if hippos were to invent gods, they would have big mouths and teeth, right? But what we're doing there, Spinoza is worried about a similar thing. We shouldn't confuse our nature with God's nature, because if we do, we are sort of superimposing a human form of God onto the divine, right? He points out, we especially do this because we do not know how feelings originate in the human mind. And so again, he's going to say, if you actually thought about where a feeling like hatred or envy came from, you might realize that hatred or envy might be in certain ways responses to the fact that you are a limited mortal being with certain kinds of vulnerabilities. We should remember that God does not have those kinds of vulnerabilities, and therefore it would be a mistake to superimpose those kinds of thinking onto, this infinite being that couldn't but exist. So I'll just wrap up with some contrasts with Descartes. Well, notice actually for Descartes, he said that mind, with the attribute of thought, that is, anytime you have something that's thinking, there must be a mind, a soul substance underneath it, and body, that has the attribute of extension. Anything extended is going to be a material thing. Descartes is going to call these separate and finite substances. And Descartes is going to say that these things are finite because they depend on God, the infinite substance. So if you go to Meditation 3, which is at page 110 in the Shapiro and Lascano book, you'll notice that Descartes says that God created us, so God made your soul. Descartes even says that God keeps you in existence from moment to moment. So if God were not like running the show at all times, you would just poof out of existence. As Descartes puts it, creation and preservation from the right point of view, maybe like the objective, actual point of view, these things are not fundamentally different. Right? So we've got the infinite substance that is God, has to exist, bringing temporarily existent beings into existence. Descartes calls these things finite substances. They are things with independent existence, but which are at the same time dependent on God. And that actually reveals Spinoza's problem with this sort of dualistic thinking, is that the idea of finite substance for Spinoza will be incoherent, right? No true substance could depend on anything else, right? So he's going to say, if materiality and extension, like there is in this mechanical pencil, if this depends on God keeping it in existence, well, then it's not really a substance, right? Because it's a being with dependent existence. To be a substance is all about being an independently existing thing. So on the Spinoza view, instead of making thought and extension attributes of their own separate substances, they're just going to be attributes of the one substance, God. Now, just to tie this back, in the previous video I discussed Spinoza's principle of sufficient reason, the idea that everything happens for a reason and that nothing happens with no explanation. Well, Spinoza is going to say that we can actually explain the interaction between the mind and the body because thought and extension are attributes of the same thing. So for instance, we don't have to say that the interaction between mind and body is this inexplicable interaction between these two fundamentally different attributes, and they are fundamentally different. Well, if we stop treating them as substances, mind and body, but rather modes of being of ultimate reality, then we could say, well, these are two different aspects that spring forth from the same thing. Now look at this pencil. It has both weight and it also has color, right? Now we might actually say that you cannot understand the weight of a thing in terms of its color, and you cannot understand the color of a thing in terms of its weight, right? That might be the point, that like, look, these things do not explain each other well at all. So you can't understand these attributes in terms of one another because they have very little in common. But what they do have in common, thankfully, is that they are part of one underlying reality. And so if we think about the weight and the color of this object, we might say, well, that is because of certain ways that the atoms are arranged in it. And one way that we can talk about its arrangement is going to be that it's going to reflect light back to my eye and to that camera there in a certain way that gives it these features of yellowness and greenness. We would also say that that underlying reality gives it a certain mass, which then, in the presence of gravity, is converted into weight, right? And we might start to make similar moves. It's very hard to understand minds in terms of bodies or bodies in terms of minds, but if we think about materiality and thought as emerging from one more basic kind of underlying reality that can give rise to both of those attributes, maybe we have a way of thinking about the relationship between mind and body, not treating them as substances like Descartes did, in a way that might be more philosophically satisfying. Now, we're going to continue our discussion later in the week with a closer look at how Spinoza thinks about mind and body, as well as how Spinoza thinks about free will. So we will take things up from there. But just to wrap up, what we get from Spinoza is a very different picture of God than perhaps traditional Christianity gives us. Or in Spinoza's case, Spinoza was a Jewish philosopher and was in fact excommunicated from his church for advocating these views that treated God as not as a being in a transcendental reality, but instead as part and parcel of every part of reality that actually exists. This gives us a rather different and unorthodox picture of God. And yeah, as Einstein put it, a God who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists, rather than a separate being who is sort of like a person rather than the underlying fundamental nature of reality. So, I hope this has been an enlightening picture of how Spinoza thinks about God. And as always, I'll thank you for listening and welcome any questions or comments as they might emerge. So, thanks. Take care.